The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Harold Whitmore's modest ranch house in suburban Denver, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Margaret had once polished to perfection. The three-bedroom home sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Lakewood, where they'd raised David and built a life together over 4 decades. At 78, Harold moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to respect his body's limitations, though his mind remained as sharp as the day he'd sold his construction company 15 years ago. The house felt too large, now filled with the echoes of conversations that would never happen again, and the silence of a woman's laughter that had once filled every corner. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter next to her favorite coffee mug, a ceramic piece painted with sunflowers that David had made in a high school art class. Harold couldn't bring himself to move these small artifacts of their shared life, even though their presence sometimes made the loneliness more acute. He stood at the kitchen counter, preparing his usual breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee, when the phone rang. The sound cut through the morning quiet like an unwelcome intrusion. The caller ID showed his son David's number, and Harold felt the familiar mix of hope and resignation that accompanied any communication from his only child. These calls had become increasingly infrequent over the years, usually brief and perfunctory, leaving Harold feeling more disconnected from his son than before they'd spoken. David lived only 20 minutes away in an affluent neighborhood in Littleton, in a 2-story colonial that Harold had helped finance but had visited only a handful of times. His daughter-in-law Sarah was pleasant enough when they encountered each other at the occasional family gathering, but Harold sensed a subtle disapproval in her manner, as if she found his simple lifestyle and modest means somehow embarrassing. The grandchildren, Emma and Jake, were polite but distant, clearly more comfortable with their other grandparents who lived in an upscale retirement community and showered them with expensive gifts. "Morning, Dad," David's voice carried its usual tone of barely concealed impatience. "I won't be able to make it over this weekend. Sarah's got some charity thing, and the kids have soccer." Harold gripped the phone tighter, though he kept his voice steady. "That's all right, son. Maybe next weekend." But even as he said the words, Harold knew there wouldn't be a next weekend. There never was any more. The pattern had become predictable. David would make tentative plans, something would come up, and Harold would spend another weekend alone with his memories and the projects that kept his hands busy but couldn't fill the growing void in his chest. "Yeah, maybe. Look, I've got to run. Talk to you later." The line went dead before Harold could respond, leaving him holding the silent phone and staring at his reflection in the kitchen window. The man looking back at him seemed older than his 78 years, worn down by the accumulation of small disappointments and the gradual realization that the son he'd raised with such love and pride had somehow become a stranger. He set the phone down carefully, as if it were made of glass, and returned to his oatmeal. The silence of the house pressed around him like a weight. Margaret's absence, even 3 years after her passing, still felt like a missing limb. After breakfast, Harold decided to fix the loose gutter that had been bothering him for weeks. It was the kind of maintenance task that Margaret would have insisted they hire someone to handle, but Harold had always been a hands-on man, more comfortable with tools than with sitting idle. The work gave him purpose, a sense that he was still capable of taking care of his domain, even if he couldn't seem to maintain his relationship with his son. Margaret would have scolded him for attempting such work at his age, reminding him that they had enough money saved to hire professionals for dangerous tasks. She'd been the practical one in their marriage, the voice of reason that kept Harold's stubborn independence in check. But she wasn't there to stop him anymore, and the silence of the house had become so oppressive that even the risk of climbing a ladder seemed preferable to another morning of solitude. He pulled the aluminum ladder from the garage, noting how much heavier it seemed than it used to be. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves from a neighbour's yard. Harold positioned the ladder against the side of the house and began his slow ascent. Each rung felt solid beneath his feet, and for a moment he felt like the man he used to be, capable, strong, able to handle whatever life threw at him. He was reaching for the loose section of gutter when it happened. His foot slipped on a rung. That was slicker with morning dew than he'd realized. Time seemed to slow as he felt himself falling backward, the blue Colorado sky spinning above him. His last coherent thought before hitting the ground was of Margaret, and how disappointed she'd be in his stubbornness. Mrs. Patterson from next door found him 20 minutes later, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. The paramedics arrived. Within minutes of her frantic 911 call, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos Harold felt when consciousness flickered back during the ambulance ride. The young EMT working over him had kind eyes and gentle hands, treating Harold with the sort of respect and care that he'd begun to think was reserved for younger patients. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" The EMT leaned over him, checking his pupils with a small flashlight while monitoring his vital signs. Harold Whitmore," he managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The words came out slurred, and he could taste blood where he'd bitten his tongue during the fall. "Good. That's very good, Mr. Whitmore. We're taking you to Presbyterian St. Joseph. You've had a fall, but you're going to be okay. Can you tell me what year it is?" Harold answered the orientation questions correctly, though each word felt like it required tremendous effort. The paramedic's reassuring presence reminded him of the kindness that still existed in the world, even when his own family seemed to have forgotten how to show it. The hospital's emergency room buzzed with controlled urgency, a symphony of medical, equipment, and human efficiency. Nurses moved between curtained areas with practiced grace, while doctors consulted in hushed tones over tablets and charts. The smell of antiseptic, mixed with the underlying tension that permeated all emergency departments, the constant awareness that life and death decisions were being made with each shift change. Harold found himself on a gurney in one of the treatment bays, his head throbbing and his left arm aching something fierce. The ceiling tiles above him were stained with age and marked with small holes that he found himself counting to distract from the pain. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying while a mother's voice offered gentle comfort. The sounds of human connection, of families caring for each other, made Harold's solitude feel even more pronounced. "Mr. Whitmore?" A nurse appeared beside his bed, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and greying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Linda Martinez, RN. "I'm going to be taking care of you today. We've called your emergency contact, your son David. He should be here soon." Harold nodded, though the movement sent a spike of pain through his skull. Despite everything, despite the distance that had grown between them over the years like a slow-spreading cancer, he felt a flutter of hope. Maybe this would be different. Maybe David would remember that beneath the aging exterior was still his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike on these very Denver streets, who had worked double shifts at the construction site to pay for his college education, who had been there for every important moment until David decided he was too busy for important moments himself. Perhaps an emergency would cut through whatever barriers had grown between them. Perhaps the fragility of life would remind David that his father wouldn't be around forever, that opportunities for connection and reconciliation had expiration dates. Harold allowed himself to hope that his son would rush to his bedside with concern and love, ready to bridge the gap that had widened with each missed holiday and postponed visit. An hour passed with agonizing slowness. Then, too, Harold dozed, fitfully, his rest interrupted by the constant activity around him and the persistent pain from his injuries. Each time he awakened, it was to the sound of footsteps approaching his curtained area, and each time he hoped to see his son's familiar face appearing through the gap in the fabric. But it was always someone else. Doctors checking his chart with professional concern, nurses adjusting his IV with gentle efficiency, orderlies wheeling equipment past his bed with practiced indifference. The waiting gave Harold too much time to think about the trajectory of his relationship with David. When had the warm, affectionate boy become this distant, dutiful stranger? When had Sunday dinners become monthly phone calls, then holiday visits, then the current pattern of sporadic contact that felt more like obligation than love? Harold could pinpoint Margaret's diagnosis as a turning point. David had seemed overwhelmed by his mother's illness, visiting less frequently, as if her condition was something that might be contagious. When David finally arrived, it was past 3 in the afternoon. Harold heard his voice before he saw him, that distinctive baritone that had once made Harold so proud when David spoke at his high school graduation. "I'm here about Harold Whitmore. I'm his son. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Your father is stable, but we're keeping him for observation. He has a concussion and some bruising, but considering his age, he was quite lucky." Harold smiled despite his pain. David was here. That had to mean something. But then he heard the conversation that would shatter whatever remained of his illusions about their relationship and change the course of both their lives forever. "Doctor, I need to be honest with you," David's voice carried clearly through the thin curtain that separated Harold's treatment area from the main corridor. "My father is, well, he's just some old man at this point. His mind isn't what it used to be, and frankly, I can't be running over here every time he does something foolish like climbing ladders at his age. Do whatever you think is best medically, but don't expect me to be involved in every decision. He made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. I have my own family to worry about, my own responsibilities that can't be put on hold every time he has an accident." The bay. Words hit Harold like physical blows, each phrase driving deeper into his chest until he felt like he couldn't breathe. "Just some old man." The phrase echoed in his mind with devastating clarity, erasing 78 years of life, love, and accomplishment with casual cruelty. Every sacrifice he'd made for David, every proud moment he'd cherished, every hope he'd harbored for their future relationship, all of it reduced to the dismissive assessment of a burden to be managed rather than a father to be loved. He lay perfectly still, afraid that any movement might reveal that he'd heard, not just heard, but understood exactly what his son thought of him. Nurse Martinez had been standing near the nurse's station when David spoke, and Harold saw her, glance toward his curtained area, her expression troubled and compassionate. She'd heard it too. Linda Martinez had worked in this hospital for over 2 decades, and in that time she'd witnessed countless family dynamics play out in moments of crisis. She'd seen children rally around aging parents with fierce devotion, and she'd seen others who viewed their elderly relatives as inconvenient obligations. But rarely had she heard such casual dismissal expressed so callously within earshot of the patient himself. Linda had grown up in a traditional Mexican-American household where respect for elders was not just expected, but sacred. Her own grandfather had lived with her family until his death at 93, and some of her most cherished memories involved sitting at his feet while he shared stories of his youth in Guadalajara. The idea of referring to any elderly person as just some old man, let alone one's own father, was so foreign to her worldview that it took her a moment to process what she'd actually heard. She watched Harold's face carefully, noting the way his expression had changed from hopeful anticipation to something approaching devastation. His vital signs on the monitor showed an increased heart rate, and she could see him struggling to control his breathing. This wasn't just the pain from his physical injuries. This was the much deeper wound of emotional betrayal. "Mr. Whitmore," the doctor's voice was carefully neutral, though Linda could detect the professional disapproval beneath his measured tone. "Your father is a person who deserves dignity and care, regardless of his age. We'll treat him according to medical standards, not according to family convenience. Age does not diminish a person's worth or their right to compassionate care." There was a pause, then David's voice again, slightly defensive but unrepentant. "Look, I didn't mean it like that. It's just complicated. You don't understand the situation. How long will he need to stay here anyway? I have meetings tomorrow, and my wife has commitments." "Mr. Whitmore will remain overnight for observation, possibly longer depending on his recovery progress. Head injuries in elderly patients require careful monitoring. I would recommend that family members be available for updates and to provide emotional support during the recovery process." "Fine. I'll check back tomorrow if I can manage it. But like I said, don't expect me to be here for every little thing." The casual cruelty of those words, "every little thing," referring to his father's serious injury and hospitalization, made Linda's hands clench into fists. She'd seen many difficult family situations over the years, but something about Harold's dignified bearing and his son's callous dismissal particularly affected her. There was something about the elderly man that reminded her of her own grandfather, a quiet strength and fundamental decency that deserved so much better than this treatment. Harold heard David's footsteps retreating down the hallway, the sound growing fainter until it disappeared entirely into the general bustle of the hospital. He didn't come to the bedside. He didn't poke his head through the curtain to say hello, to ask how Harold was feeling, to offer even a moment of comfort or connection. He simply left, treating his father's serious injury as nothing more than an administrative matter to be handled efficiently and forgotten. The silence that followed felt deafening. Harold stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small perforations in an attempt to keep his mind occupied with something other than the devastating realization that his son viewed him as a burden, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder, matching the rhythm of his racing pulse as the full implications of what he'd heard began to sink in. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear other families navigating their own medical crises. A woman's voice was reading to someone, probably a husband or father. Children's laughter echoed from the pediatric wing, the normal sounds of human connection and care that made Harold's isolation feel even more profound. These were the sounds of families who understood that illness and injury were opportunities to show love and support, not inconveniences to be minimized and delegated. Nurse Martinez appeared at Harold's bedside a few minutes later, her expression gentle but knowing. She pulled up a chair, a gesture that immediately set her apart from the other medical staff who typically stood while delivering care or checking vitals. This simple act of sitting down, of positioning herself at Harold's eye level, communicated a level of respect and attention that he hadn't experienced from his own family in years. "Mr. Whitmore, how are you feeling? Any nausea or dizziness? Are you experiencing any vision problems or confusion?" Her voice was warm and professional, but Harold could detect something else beneath the clinical questions, a genuine concern that went beyond her job requirements. "No more than usual," Harold replied quietly, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "Thank you for standing up for me back there. You didn't have to do that." Linda studied his face carefully, noting the way his eyes had filled with unshed tears and the tremor in his hands that she suspected wasn't entirely related to his head injury. She'd been a nurse long enough to recognize the difference between physical pain and emotional trauma, and what she saw in Harold's expression was heartbreak in its purest form. Linda pulled up a chair beside his bed, another deliberate gesture. that communicated her willingness to spend time with him as a person, rather than simply treating him as a medical case to be processed. "I've been a nurse for 22 years, Mr. Whitmore, and I've learned that age doesn't diminish a person's worth. It enhances it. Every line on your face, every grey hair, they're badges of experience, of survival, of a life lived with purpose and meaning. They represent decades of work, love, sacrifice, and wisdom that younger people like your son haven't had the opportunity to accumulate yet." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In my culture, in my family, elderly people are treasures. My grandfather lived with us until he died, and we considered ourselves blessed to have his wisdom and stories in our daily lives. What I heard out there—" She shook her head sadly. "That's not how families should treat each other. That's not how any human being should be dismissed." Harold felt tears threatening and blinked them back, not wanting to break down in front of this kind woman who was treating him with more respect and compassion than his own son had shown. "He wasn't always like this, you know. David, he used to be different. When he was younger, he was caring and thoughtful. I don't know when that changed, or maybe I just didn't want to see it changing." "People change," Linda said simply, but her tone carried decades of experience with human nature and family dynamics. Sometimes life makes them harder, more focused on their own concerns. Sometimes success makes them forget where they came from. Sometimes they get so caught up in their own struggles that they lose sight of the people who loved them first and longest. But that doesn't mean you have to accept being treated poorly. You have value, Mr. Whitmore. You have worth that exists completely independent of what anyone else thinks or says about you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Harold looked at this woman who had known him for less than a day, but was treating him with more kindness and respect than he'd received from his own family in months. "My wife used to say things like that. Margaret. She passed away 3 years ago, and sometimes I think David blames me for outliving her. Like I should have been the one to go first." "Oh, Mr. Whitmore." Linda's voice was soft with sympathy. "Grief affects people differently, and sometimes it makes them lash out at the people who remind them of their loss. But that's not an excuse for cruelty. Your wife would want you to be treated with love and dignity, wouldn't she?" "She would." Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "Margaret always said that how we treat people in their most vulnerable moments reveals our true character. She would be heartbroken to see how David spoke about me today." As evening fell and the hospital settled into its quieter night rhythm, Harold lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, his mind churning with thoughts that were both painful and clarifying. The pain medication made his thoughts fuzzy around the edges, but one thing remained crystal clear: the sound of his son's voice saying those words. "Just some old man." The phrase had burned itself into his memory with the permanence of a brand, marking the moment when his last illusions about their relationship had finally died. He thought about Margaret, about the conversations they'd had in her final months about their son's increasing distance and emotional unavailability. She'd made excuses for David then. He was busy with work, stressed about money, overwhelmed with his own family responsibilities. But Harold had seen the truth even then, though he'd been too much of a coward to voice it, too afraid of confirming Margaret's worst fears about their son. David was ashamed of them, of their simple life, their modest means, their small concerns. He'd outgrown them, moved beyond them into a world where elderly parents were inconveniences rather than treasures. What David didn't know, what nobody knew except Margaret and their lawyer, Robert Chen, was that Harold Whitmore was far from the poor, helpless old man his son imagined him to be. The construction company he'd built from nothing, starting with a single truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days, had sold for $12 million when Harold finally decided to retire. He'd invested wisely over the years, lived simply by choice rather than necessity, and accumulated a fortune that would have surprised everyone who knew him, including the son who had just dismissed him as worthless. The original estate plan had been simple and traditional. Everything would go to David when Harold passed away. The will had been drawn up with love and hope, imagining a son who would use the inheritance wisely, perhaps to secure his children's education or to give his own family the financial freedom that Harold had never enjoyed in his younger years. Harold had pictured David's surprise and gratitude when he learned about his father's careful stewardship of their family's resources. But lying there in that hospital bed, listening to the sounds of monitors beeping and nurses making their rounds, hearing the distant conversations of families who actually cared about their elderly relatives, Harold made a decision that would change everything. If David saw him as just some old man, worthless, burdensome, disposable, then perhaps it was time to show his son exactly what this old man was capable of. Perhaps it was time to demonstrate that dismissing someone based on their age and apparent circumstances could be a very costly mistake. The next morning would bring visitors Harold wasn't expecting, and a conversation that would leave Nurse Martinez speechless and his son reeling with the consequences of his casual cruelty. But for now, Harold closed his eyes and began to plan, his mind working with the same strategic thinking that had built his business empire from nothing. David wanted to treat him like a powerless old man? Fine. Harold would show him what real power looked like. Harold woke to the sound of breakfast trays rattling down the hospital corridor, accompanied by the gentle murmur of early morning conversations between patients and staff. Morning light streamed through his room's single window, casting geometric patterns on the linoleum floor, and for a moment he forgot where he was. The institutional surroundings felt foreign after a lifetime of waking up in his own bed, in the house he and Margaret had made into a home through decades of shared mornings and quiet conversations over coffee. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back with devastating clarity: the fall, the hospital, and most painfully, David's words echoing in his mind like a cruel refrain. The physical pain from his injuries had diminished overnight, but the emotional wound felt as fresh and raw as if his son had spoken those dismissive words just moments ago. Just some old man. The phrase had taken root in his consciousness like a splinter, impossible to ignore or extract. Harold tested his mobility carefully, moving his arms and legs to assess the damage from his fall. The bruising was extensive but not debilitating, and his head, while still tender, no longer throbbed with the intensity of the previous evening. Physically, he was healing. Emotionally, however, he felt like he was standing at a crossroads that would determine the trajectory of his remaining years. Nurse Martinez appeared with his breakfast tray, her manner as warm and respectful as it had been the evening before. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of caregiving, but Harold noticed that she took extra time with him, adjusting his pillows and ensuring his water glass was full, small gestures that communicated genuine concern rather than mere professional obligation. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. How are you feeling today? Any lingering dizziness or nausea from yesterday's injury?" Her voice carried the same warmth that had comforted him during the dark hours of the previous evening, when the pain of his son's rejection had threatened to overwhelm him entirely. "Better, thank you." Harold struggled to sit up, and Linda quickly adjusted his bed to a more comfortable position, her movements careful and considerate. Physically, anyway. The emotional bruises are taking longer to heal than the physical ones. Linda's expression softened with understanding. That's often the case with family situations like this. Physical injuries heal on a predictable timeline, but emotional wounds follow their own schedule. Has David called this morning to check on you?" The slight pause before she asked the question told Harold everything he needed to know. She'd expected this question, had probably been dreading having to ask it, knowing what the answer would likely be. Her experience with families in crisis had taught her to recognize the patterns of neglect and dismissal that characterized dysfunctional relationships. "Not yet, but the morning is still young." Harold nodded, though they both knew David wouldn't be calling. He picked at his scrambled eggs, his appetite diminished by the hollow feeling in his chest. Just some old man. The words had taken root in his mind like a cancer. "Mr. Whitmore," Linda said gently, "you have some visitors coming this morning. They called earlier. Something about a scheduled appointment that couldn't be postponed." Harold's fork paused midway to his mouth. He'd completely forgotten. Today was the day he was supposed to meet with representatives from the hospital's Charitable Foundation to finalize the donation he'd been planning for months. Margaret's final wish had been to give back to the community that had embraced them, particularly to the hospital that had cared for her so tenderly during her last days. "Yes," he said quietly. "That would be about the Charitable Foundation." Linda raised an eyebrow. "The Harold Whitmore Foundation? That's you?" Harold looked surprised. "You know about it?" "Mr. Whitmore, everyone in this hospital knows about the planned donation. $15 million doesn't go unnoticed. There's going to be a new cancer wing named after your wife, the Margaret Whitmore Cancer Center." The irony wasn't lost on Harold. His son had dismissed him as worthless while standing in the very hospital that was about to honor his family's generosity. He set down his fork and looked at Linda with newfound resolve. "Nurse Martinez, would you mind staying when they arrive? I may need a witness." Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Is everything all right?" Before Harold could answer, 3 people in business attire appeared at his doorway. The lead figure was Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the hospital's chief of development, an elegant woman in her 50s whom Harold had met several times during the planning stages of his donation. "Harold!" Dr. Reynolds approached with a warm smile, though her expression showed concern for his condition. "We were so sorry to hear about your accident. Are you feeling well enough for our meeting, or should we reschedule?" "I'm fine, Patricia. Please come in." Harold gestured to the chairs around his bed. "This is Nurse Martinez, Linda. She's been taking excellent care of me. I'd like her to stay, if that's acceptable." Dr. Reynolds nodded to Linda with professional courtesy, then introduced her companions. James Wright, the hospital's legal counsel, and Maria Santos, the Foundation's communications director. "Harold, we have all the final paperwork here," Dr. Reynolds said, opening her briefcase. "The $15 million donation will be distributed as we discussed. $10 million for the new cancer wing construction, $3 million for equipment, and $2 million for an endowment fund. The Margaret Whitmore Cancer Center will be a lasting tribute to your wife's memory." Harold felt a familiar warmth at the mention of Margaret's name, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of David's callous words. He watched as James Wright spread the documents across the adjustable table that spanned his bed. "There are several documents to sign," Wright explained, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man accustomed to handling large sums of money. "The donation agreement, the naming rights contract, and the estate planning documents that designate your son David as the primary beneficiary of your remaining assets." Harold stared at the papers, his mind racing. This was the moment of truth. He could sign everything as planned, ensuring that David would inherit what remained of his fortune, still several $1 million even after the charitable donation. Or he could make a change that would send a message his son would never forget. "Actually," Harold said slowly, "I need to make some modifications to these documents." Dr. Reynolds looked concerned. "Modifications?" "Harold, We've spent months planning. The donation stands as planned, Harold interrupted gently. But I want to change the estate planning portion. I want to remove my son as beneficiary and instead establish a scholarship fund, the Harold and Margaret Whitmore Educational Trust, for students from working-class families who want to pursue healthcare careers. The silence in the room was palpable. James Wright's pen stopped moving, and Maria Santos looked up from her notes with surprise. But it was Linda Martinez's expression that caught Harold's attention. She was staring at him with something approaching awe. "Harold," Dr. Reynolds said carefully, "this is a significant change. Are you certain? Perhaps you should discuss this with your family first." Harold's laugh was bitter. "My family has already made their position quite clear. Yesterday, when I was brought in after my fall, my son told your medical staff that I was just some old man and that they should do whatever they wanted with me. He couldn't even be bothered to visit me properly, just gave his instructions and left." The room fell silent again. Linda shifted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd witnessed the conversation, and her presence now felt like validation of Harold's pain. "Nurse Martinez was there," Harold continued, his voice gaining strength. "She heard what he said. She saw how he left without even checking on me. If that's how my son views me, as just some disposable old man, then perhaps it's time I showed him what this old man is really worth." Maria Santos leaned forward, her reporter's instincts clearly engaged. "Mr. Whitmore, this is a remarkable story. Would you be willing to share it publicly? The community should know about this level of generosity and, frankly, about the circumstances that prompted it." Harold considered this. The idea of public recognition had never appealed to him. He'd always preferred to keep his charitable giving private. But something about David's dismissive words had lit a fire in him that refused to be extinguished. "Yes," he said finally. "I think people should know, not for my sake but for Margaret's. She believed in the power of family, in treating each other with dignity and respect. Maybe sharing this story will remind others to value the elderly members of their families while they still can." James Wright cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Whitmore, I have to advise you that this type of decision, made in what could be seen as an emotional state following an accident, might be challenged legally by your son." Harold's eyes hardened. "Mr. Wright, I'm 78 years old, not 78 months old. My mind is perfectly clear. I built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, managed complex investments for decades, and planned this charitable donation over the course of a year. If my son wants to challenge my mental capacity, I welcome the opportunity to demonstrate exactly how sharp this just some old man really is." Linda Martinez spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I can attest to Mr. Whitmore's mental clarity. He's been completely coherent and rational throughout his stay here. Yesterday's conversation with his son was illuminating." Harold smiled at her gratefully. "Thank you, Linda. Your support means more than you know." Dr. Reynolds gathered herself and assumed her professional demeanor. "Very well, Harold. If this is truly what you want, we can have the documents modified." "James, how long will the revisions take?" "I can have new documents prepared within an hour," Wright replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "Excellent." Harold leaned back against his pillows, feeling lighter than he had in months. "And Maria, I want the announcement to be clear about the circumstances. I want people to know that this donation is being made in honor of my late wife, Margaret, who taught me that true wealth lies in how we treat others, especially those who seem to have little power or value in society's eyes." As the hospital staff began gathering their materials to prepare the revised documents, Harold noticed Linda Martinez wiping away a tear. "Are you all right, Linda?" She nodded, composing herself. "I'm fine, Mr. Whitmore. It's just... in 22 years of nursing, I've seen too many elderly patients dismissed by their families, treated as burdens rather than treasures. What you're doing sends a powerful message." Harold reached over and patted her hand. "Margaret always said that how we treat the vulnerable members of our society, the elderly, the sick, the forgotten, reveals our true character. I think she'd approve of this decision." As the group prepared to leave to draft the new documents, Harold felt a sense of peace settling over him. The physical pain from his fall was already fading, but the emotional pain from David's rejection had been transformed into something else entirely. A sense of purpose, of final vindication for a lifetime of hard work and quiet dignity. But Harold knew that the most difficult part was still to come. Sooner or later, David would learn about what had happened in this hospital room, and when he did, the conversation that followed would determine whether there was any hope left for their relationship, or if his son's greed would finally destroy whatever bond remained between them. Outside his window, Harold could see the Denver skyline gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, David was going about his day, completely unaware that his offhand cruelty had just cost him millions of dollars. Harold wondered what his son's reaction would be when he learned the truth. He didn't have to wonder for long. By noon, word had begun to spread through the hospital corridors like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The news that Harold Whitmore, the unassuming elderly man in room 314, was the philanthropist behind the largest single donation in the hospital's history, travelled from the development office to the nurses' stations, from the administrative floors to the maintenance crews. Linda Martinez had returned to her regular duties, but she found herself checking on Harold more frequently than necessary. Each time she entered his room, she was struck by the transformation in his demeanour. The defeated, heartbroken man from the previous evening had been replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet dignity and newfound purpose. "The papers are ready for your signature, Mr. Whitmore," James Wright announced as he returned with Dr. Reynolds and Maria Santos. The revised documents were spread across Harold's bedside table with the same ceremony that might accompany the signing of a peace treaty. Harold reviewed each page carefully, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The donation agreement remained unchanged, $15 million to establish the Margaret Whitmore Cancer Center. But the estate planning documents told a different story. Instead of David inheriting the remaining millions, a new educational trust would provide scholarships for students from working-class backgrounds who wanted to pursue healthcare careers. "The trust will be administered by the Hospital Foundation," Wright explained, "and will provide full tuition assistance for approximately 50 students per year in perpetuity. The announcement will go out this afternoon, and the formal presentation ceremony is scheduled for next week." Harold signed each document with deliberate care, his signature as steady as it had been 40 years ago when he'd incorporated his construction company. As he set down the pen, he felt Margaret's presence more strongly than he had since her funeral. She would have been proud of this moment. "There's one more thing," Maria Santos said, consulting her notes. "We've had several media inquiries already. The story of your donation, combined with the circumstances that prompted the estate changes, is quite compelling. Would you be willing to give interviews?" Harold considered this. "I'll speak to one reporter, but I want you to choose someone who will tell the story accurately and respectfully. This isn't about revenge against my son. It's about honoring my wife's memory and reminding people to value their elderly family members." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "I know just the person. Sarah Chen from the Denver Post. She specializes in human interest stories and has covered our hospital extensively. She's fair and thoughtful. As the hospital officials departed with their signed documents, Linda Martinez lingered behind. "Mr. Whitmore, are you prepared for your son's reaction when he learns about this?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city where he'd spent most of his adult life. "I've been preparing for this conversation in my mind since 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Linda. Not the conversation I expected to have with David, but the one his actions have made necessary." He didn't have to wait long. At 2:47 p.m., Harold's phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number, but the tone when Harold answered suggested this wouldn't be the usual perfunctory check-in. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" David's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I just got a call from some reporter asking about your donation to the hospital and why you cut me out of your will. She said you gave away $15 million to dollars? $15 million? Where did you even get that kind of money?" Harold had rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times, but actually hearing the greed and entitlement in his son's voice still shocked him. "Hello, David. I'm feeling much better, thank you for asking. The concussion seems to be clearing up nicely." "Cut the crap, Dad. Is this real? Did you actually give away my inheritance?" "Your inheritance." Harold's voice remained calm, but Linda, who was adjusting his IV nearby, could see his hands trembling slightly. "I wasn't aware that you had any legal claim to money I earned through 50 years of hard work. You know what I mean. I'm your son. I'm your only family. That money should come to me." Harold closed his eyes briefly, remembering the little boy who used to help him in his workshop, who would climb onto his lap to hear bedtime stories, who had once looked at his father with admiration rather than calculation. "David, do you remember what you said to the medical staff yesterday when you came to check on me after my fall?" There was a pause. "What are you talking about?" "You told them I was just some old man, and that they should do whatever they wanted with me. You couldn't even be bothered to come to my bedside to see how I was doing. You gave your instructions and left." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, I was stressed. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Harold's voice was steady but firm. "You meant every word. And you're right, David. I am just some old man. But this particular old man built a construction company from nothing and sold it for $12 million. This old man invested wisely and accumulated enough wealth to give away $15 million and still have plenty left over. And this old man has decided that money should go to people who understand the value of caring for others, not to someone who views his father as a burden." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Harold wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, David spoke, his voice a mixture of shock and calculation. $12 million? Dad, I had no idea you had that kind of money. Why didn't you tell me? Because your mother and I wanted to know that you loved us for who we were, not what we had. Unfortunately, your behavior yesterday made it clear that you don't love us at all." "That's not fair." David's voice rose. "I have my own family to worry about, my own responsibilities. I can't drop everything every time you have a medical emergency." "I wasn't asking you to drop everything, David. I was asking you to show basics, human decency to your father. Instead, you told the hospital staff to treat me like a disposable object." Harold could hear David taking deep breaths on the other end of the line, clearly trying to control his temper and calculate his next move. "Look, Dad, maybe I could have handled things better yesterday, but you can't just give away my children's future because you're upset about some misunderstanding." "Your children's future?" Harold's voice hardened. "When was the last time you brought my grandchildren to see me, David? When was the last time they called me? When was the last time you even mentioned my name to them?" You've spent years making sure they don't have a relationship with me, and now you want to claim I'm stealing their inheritance." Linda had finished with the IV but remained in the room, clearly recognizing that Harold might need support during this difficult conversation. David's tone shifted, becoming more conciliatory. "Dad, I know I haven't been the best son lately. Work has been stressful, and Sarah's been dealing with her mother's health issues. But we can fix this. I can visit. More often, bring the kids by. Just don't do anything permanent before we have a chance to talk this through properly." Harold felt a flicker of the old hope, the same hope that had sustained him through years of increasingly distant phone calls and cancelled visits. But then he remembered David's voice yesterday. "He's just some old man. Do whatever you want with him. David, the papers are already signed. The donation has been made. The Margaret Whitmore Cancer Center will be built, and the Educational Trust will provide scholarships for deserving students. Your mother would be proud of what we're accomplishing. My mother would be horrified that you're destroying our family over a misunderstanding. Your mother died 3 years ago, David, and you couldn't be bothered to visit her more than twice during her final 6 months. Don't you dare invoke her memory to justify your behavior now." The accusation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Harold could hear David breathing heavily, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more uncertain. "Dad, I know I should have been there more, for both of you, but I can't change the past. Can't we figure out a way to move forward?" For a moment, Harold wavered. This was his son, his only child, the baby Margaret had nursed through countless sleepless nights, the toddler who had followed Harold around the construction sites, the young man who had made them both so proud at his college graduation. Maybe there was still hope. But then Harold thought about all the elderly patients Linda had mentioned, dismissed and discarded by families who saw them as burdens rather than treasures. He thought about Margaret's last words about the importance of dignity and respect. He thought about the scholarship recipients who would get chances they never would have had otherwise. "David, if you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that. But it won't be built on money or inheritance expectations. It will be built on whether you can see me as a human being worthy of respect and love, not as an ATM or a burden to be managed." "So that's it? You're really going to give away everything to strangers?" "I'm giving it to people who understand that caring for others is the highest calling any of us can have. If that makes them strangers to you, then maybe that's the real problem here." The line went quiet again. When David spoke next, his voice was cold and formal. "I'll be speaking to a lawyer about this. You're clearly not thinking rationally after your head injury." Harold almost laughed. "Good luck with that, son. I've got excellent legal representation, medical witnesses to my mental competency, and a very compelling story about why I made this decision. But more importantly, I've got peace of mind for the first time in years." The call ended without goodbyes. Harold set his phone on the bedside table and looked at Linda, who had been quietly witnessing the entire conversation. "That went about as well as I expected," he said with a rueful smile. Linda sat down in the chair beside his bed. "Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, do you have any regrets about what you've done?" Harold considered the question seriously. "I regret that it came to this. I regret that my son values money more than relationships. I regret that my grandchildren will grow up never knowing their grandfather. But I don't regret ensuring that Margaret's memory will be honored and that deserving young people will get opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise." Linda nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing, and I think your wife would be proud of you." Outside Harold's window, the Denver afternoon was giving way to evening. Somewhere in the city, David was probably calling lawyers and calculating his next move. But in room 314 of Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, An old man who had been dismissed as worthless was resting peacefully, secure in the knowledge that his final act of love would outlive them all. The story, however, was far from over. 3 days after the documents were signed, Harold was discharged from the hospital. The concussion had healed, the bruises were fading, and his discharge paperwork included a clean bill of health from Dr. Patricia Morgan, the attending physician who had overseen his care. As Linda Martinez helped him gather his belongings, Harold felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. The hospital had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where his worth had been recognized and his dignity restored. Returning to his empty house felt like stepping back into the loneliness that had defined his life since Margaret's death. "You'll be all right?" Linda asked as they waited for the wheelchair that would take him to the hospital entrance. "I'll be fine," Harold assured her, though they both knew the hardest part was yet to come. "You've been wonderful, Linda. I hope you know how much your kindness meant to me during all this." She squeezed his hand gently. "You gave me a gift too, Mr. Whitmore. You reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place, to advocate for people who need someone in their corner." The ride home in the taxi was quiet, the driver making small talk about the weather while Harold watched familiar neighborhoods pass by his window. When they pulled into his driveway, he saw David's car parked on the street. His son was sitting on the front porch steps, and from his posture, Harold could tell this wouldn't be a pleasant reunion. "Thanks for the ride," Harold told the driver, handling the fare and tip with shaking hands that had nothing to do with his recent injury. David stood as Harold approached the porch, his expression a mixture of anger, hurt, and something that might have been shame. He looked older than Harold remembered, with new lines around his eyes and grey threads in his dark hair. "Dad." David's voice was carefully neutral. "David." Harold unlocked the front door and, after a moment's hesitation, stepped aside to let his son enter first. The house felt smaller with both of them in it, the silence more oppressive than when Harold had been alone. They stood in the living room, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated memories, Margaret's needlepoint on the walls, photographs of David's childhood, the simple furniture they'd bought when money was tight and kept because it held sentimental value. "I've been thinking about what you said," David began, his voice carefully controlled. "About me not being there for you and Mom, about the things I said at the hospital." Harold waited, afraid to hope, but unable to stop himself from wanting this conversation to go differently than their last one. "I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I was stressed about work, worried about the kids, and when I got the call about your accident, I handled it badly. You called me just some old man, David. You told them to do whatever they wanted with me." David flinched. "I know, and I've been thinking about why I said that, why I've been pulling away from you and Mom over the years." He walked to the mantelpiece, picking up a framed photo of the three of them from David's high school graduation. "I think I was scared," he said quietly. "Scared of watching you get old, scared of losing you like we lost Mom. It was easier to keep my distance than to face the fact that you won't be around forever." Harold felt his chest tighten. This was more honesty than he'd heard from his son in years. "And maybe," David continued, still staring at the photograph, "maybe I was ashamed of the way we lived. My friend's parents had fancy houses and expensive cars, and you and Mom were always so modest. I wanted more, and I think I resented that you didn't want more too." "We had everything we needed," Harold said softly. "We had each other, we had you, we had enough money to be comfortable. What more could we want?" David set the photo down and turned to face his father. "I know that now, or at least I'm starting to understand it. But for years, I thought you were just settling. I thought you lacked ambition. And now you know, I was worth $12 million all along. Now I know that money was never the point for you." David's voice cracked slightly. "God, Dad, the things I said about you at that hospital. The nurse heard me dismiss you like you were nobody. How do you forgive something like that?" Harold studied his son's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated manipulation. What he saw was a middle-aged man grappling with the realization that he'd failed at the most basic level of human decency. "David, do you remember when you were 8 and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with a baseball?" David looked confused by the apparent change of subject. "Yeah, I remember. What did I tell you to do? You made me go apologize to her and offer to pay for the damage with my allowance money. And what did I tell you about making mistakes?" David was quiet for a moment, clearly searching his memory. "You said that everyone makes mistakes, but a good person owns up to them and tries to make things right." Harold nodded. "So the question is, David, are you here because you want to make things right, or are you here because you want the money back?" The directness of the question seemed to catch David off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling with his answer. "I'd be lying if I said the money didn't matter," he said finally. "Sarah and I have been talking about the kids' college funds, about retirement, about all the things that money could have provided. But sitting on your porch for the last hour, waiting for you to come home, I kept thinking about something else." "What's that?" "I kept thinking about how I'm going to explain to Emma and Jake why they don't have a relationship with their grandfather. How I'm going to tell them that I was too busy, too proud, too stupid to maintain the connection between them and one of the most important people in my life." Harold felt tears threatening for the first time since Margaret's funeral. "They're good kids, David. From what little I've seen of them, they're kind and curious and everything grandchildren should be. They ask about you sometimes. Emma wanted to make you a birthday card last year, but Sarah said we didn't have your address. We've lived 20 minutes away from you for 8 years, Dad. We didn't have your address because I couldn't be bothered to give it to my wife." The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Harold walked to his recliner, Margaret's chair really, though he'd been sitting in it since she died, and lowered himself carefully into it. "David, I want you to understand something. The money is gone. The donation has been made. The trust has been established. And even if I wanted to change it now, I couldn't. That decision is final." David nodded, though Harold could see the disappointment in his eyes. "But," Harold continued, "there's still plenty left. Enough to ensure I'm comfortable for the rest of my life. Enough to help with the kids' education. If you wanted that kind of relationship with me, enough to leave you something meaningful when I'm gone. The question is whether you want a father or an inheritance." "I want my father back," David said, and the simplicity of the statement broke Harold's heart. "I want my kids to know their grandfather. I want to stop being the kind of person who calls his father just some old man." Harold studied his son's face, looking for the calculation he'd heard in their phone conversation, the entitlement that had colored their relationship for years. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like hope. "Then that's what we'll work toward," Harold said quietly. "It won't be easy, David. There's a lot of hurt between us, a lot of lost time, your mother's death, the years of distance, the things that were said at the hospital. None of that goes away just because we want it to. I know, but I want to try if you'll let me." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Outside he could hear children playing in the neighborhood, the sound of dinner preparations from neighboring houses, the normal rhythms of family life that had felt so foreign to him for so long. "There are going to be conditions," he said finally. David straightened, clearly prepared for negotiations. "I want to see Emma and Jake regularly, not just when it's convenient, not just on holidays. I want to be part of their lives. Done." I want you to understand that the donation I made was in your mother's memory, and it's not up for discussion or criticism. Margaret believed in giving back, and this is how we're honoring that belief. I understand, and I want you to come with me to the ceremony next week when they announce the cancer center. I want your children to see their grandfather being honored for something meaningful, and I want them to understand that real wealth isn't measured in bank account balances. David's eyes filled with tears. Dad, I'd be proud to be there with you. Harold felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Then we'll start there and see how it goes. What about the interview with the reporter? I heard you were going to tell the whole story publicly. Harold had been dreading this part of the conversation. The interview is scheduled for tomorrow. Maria Santos from the hospital's communications department thought it would be good to share the story. Not to embarrass you, but to remind people about the importance of treating elderly family members with dignity. David winced. So everyone's going to know what I said about you. Everyone's going to know what happened, yes. But David, you have a choice about how this story ends. You can be the son who learned from his mistakes and worked to repair his relationship with his father, or you can be the son who only cared about the money. That part of the story is still being written. David was quiet for several minutes, processing this. Finally, he spoke. Would it help if I was there for the interview, if I talked about what I learned from all this? Harold looked at his son with surprise. You'd be willing to do that, to admit publicly that you were wrong? If it helps repair some of the damage I've done, yes. And if it helps other people avoid making the same mistakes I made. Harold felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the anger and hurt he'd been carrying since that day in the hospital. This wasn't the David who had dismissed him as worthless. This was the son he remembered, the one who had once been, capable of courage and growth. I think that would mean a lot, Harold said. To me, and probably to a lot of other families dealing with similar issues. They talked for another hour, tentatively beginning the process of rebuilding their relationship. David shared stories about Emma's piano recitals and Jake's soccer games, while Harold talked about the volunteer work he'd been doing at the community center and the woodworking projects that filled his empty hours. When David finally prepared to leave, he paused at the front door. Dad, I need you to know something. What I said at the hospital, that wasn't who I want to be. That wasn't who Mom raised me to be. I lost sight of what was important, and I'm grateful you found a way to remind me. Harold nodded. Your mother always said that people can change if they want to badly enough. I hope she was right. She was. I'm going to make sure she was. After David left, Harold sat in Margaret's chair and looked around the living room. The house felt different somehow, not quite as empty, not quite as lonely. The future was still uncertain, and rebuilding trust with his son would take time and effort from both of them. But for the first time in years, Harold felt hopeful. The next morning, Sarah Chen from the Denver Post arrived promptly at 10 a.m., accompanied by a photographer, and David, who looked nervous but determined. They set up in Harold's living room, the same space where he and David had their conversation the day before. Mr. Whitmore, Sarah began, this is quite a remarkable story. Can you tell me what prompted you to make such a significant donation? Harold glanced at David, who gave him an encouraging nod, then began to speak about Margaret, about their years together, about her final wish to give back to the community that had embraced them. But the timing of the donation, Sarah pressed gently, and the changes to your estate planning, those were influenced by something that happened at the hospital? Harold took a deep breath and told the story. His fall, his time in the hospital, overhearing David's dismissive words, and the decision that followed. He spoke about the pain of being called just some old man by his own son, but also about the hope for reconciliation. When it was David's turn to speak, his voice was steady. but emotional. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I let the stress and busyness of my own life blind me to what was really important. I dismissed my father as if he had no value, and in doing so, I revealed how little I understood about true worth." Sarah leaned forward. "What would you say to other adult children who might be making similar mistakes?" David was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I'd say that your parents won't be around forever, and when they're gone, you can't apologize for the time you didn't spend with them or the respect you didn't show them. Don't wait until it's too late to recognize their value. Don't wait until they're lying in a hospital bed to realize they deserve your love and attention." The interview continued for another hour, covering the details of the donation, the impact it would have on the hospital and the community, and the broader message about respecting elderly family members. Throughout it all, Harold was struck by his son's willingness to accept responsibility publicly for his mistakes. After the reporter and photographer left, Harold and David sat together on the front porch, watching the neighborhood children walk home from school. "That was harder than I expected," David admitted. "But important," Harold replied. "Your mother always said that admitting our mistakes is the first step toward becoming better people." David smiled, the first genuine smile Harold had seen from his son in years. "She was a wise woman." "Yes, she was, and I think she'd be proud of both of us today." A week later, the ceremony announcing the Margaret Whitmore Cancer Center was held in the hospital's main atrium. Harold stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included hospital staff, community leaders, local media, and, most importantly, David, Sarah, Emma, and Jake. "My wife Margaret spent her final months in this hospital," Harold began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "She received extraordinary care from people who saw her not as a diagnosis or a burden, but as a human being deserving of dignity and compassion. This donation is our way of ensuring that future patients receive that same level of care." He paused, looking at his family in the front row. Emma was fidgeting with excitement, while Jake was trying to look grown up and serious. David had tears in his eyes. "But this donation represents something else as well," Harold continued. "It represents the belief that every person, regardless of age or circumstance, has value and worth. In a society that often discards its elderly members, we must remember that wisdom and experience are treasures to be cherished, not burdens to be managed." The applause was warm and sustained. After the ceremony, Emma ran up to Harold and threw her arms around his waist. "Grandpa, you're famous," she announced proudly. Harold laughed, hugging her back. "I'm just an old man who wants to make sure people take care of each other." "You're not just an old man," Jake said solemnly. "You're our grandpa, and you're a hero." Harold looked over the children's heads at David, who was watching the interaction with wonder and gratitude. "Yes," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "I suppose I am your grandpa, and that's the most important thing I'll ever be." 6 months later, Harold received the first thank you letter from a scholarship recipient, a young woman named Maria, whose parents had cleaned offices to pay for her prerequisite courses and who was now starting nursing school thanks to the Harold and Margaret Whitmore Educational Trust. He was reading her letter aloud to Emma and Jake during their weekly Sunday dinner when David interrupted. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Harold looked up from the letter, noting the serious tone in his son's voice. "I've been thinking about what you did, giving away the money, changing your will, all of it. And I realize now that you didn't punish me that day at the hospital. You saved me." Harold set the letter down carefully. "How do you figure that?" "Because if you hadn't forced me to confront the kind of person I was becoming, I would have continued down that path. I would have missed out on all of this." David gestured around the table, where 3 generations were sharing a meal and creating new memories. I would have remained someone who saw his father as just some old man, instead of recognizing him as the remarkable person he really is. Harold felt his eyes filling with tears, something that had become more common since his grandchildren had returned to his life. "Your mother would say that everything happens for a reason," he said quietly. "Maybe it does. Or maybe good people just find ways to turn painful experiences into something meaningful." Emma, who had been listening with the serious expression children wear when they sense important adult conversations, spoke up. "Grandpa, will you tell us more about Grandma Margaret?" Harold smiled, wiping his eyes. "I'd love to, sweetheart. She would have adored both of you." As Harold began sharing stories about Margaret, her laugh, her kindness, her belief in the power of family, he realized that this was her true legacy. Not the cancer center that would bear her name, not the scholarships that would change young lives, but this moment, 3 generations connected by love, respect, and the understanding that every person has inherent worth. Outside the Denver. Evening was settling over the neighborhood with its familiar sounds of family life. Inside Harold's modest house, an old man who had once been dismissed as worthless was surrounded by the riches that truly mattered: the love of his family, the knowledge that his wife's memory was being honored, and the peace that comes from a life well lived. The story that had begun with cruelty and dismissal had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of dignity, the importance of second chances, and the truth that real wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the love we give and receive. Harold Whitmore was no longer just some old man. He was a grandfather, a philanthropist, a man whose actions had reminded an entire community about the value of treating every person with respect and compassion. And in the end, that was worth more than all the money in the world.